Hi everybody, it's David, and today I want to talk about ideation, or where we get ideas from. Why aren't we teaching it? Whether we should, and if so, how should we do that? The things that keep me up at night are the big problems about maintaining a planet where life can actually live. So the climate crisis, global warming, that sort of stuff is bothersome, as is deforestation, ocean acidification, the loss of our coral reefs, pollution of all sorts, ocean pollution, air pollution, extinction and the loss of our diverse species, and of course, human suffering and hunger. We're constantly looking for energy solutions, and it just seems like we always seem to come up short. And the thinking in general is that there's going to be some nameless, faceless, smart person who's going to solve all of our problems for us. However, in order for us to get back to our consumer-driven lives, we're going to need teachers to step up and teach us how to come up with some better ideas. Right now we have this pandemic that is forcing us to make some major changes in our lives. And once again, we are hoping that there are some really smart people out there that are working on the problem. But why does it have to be smart people? Ideas can come from anywhere. There's a classic story that talks about a truck that became stuck underneath an overpass. And when they brought in engineers and firemen and policemen to try to figure out how they were going to solve this problem, a kid walked by and said, "Why don't you let the air out of the tires?" Ideas don't have to come from really smart people. They can come from anyone. Floating in the North Pacific Ocean is a tremendous amount of garbage, specifically plastic. They call it the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And we need to clean it up as all this plastic is getting into our food system. It's working its way through the environment, and we don't want that. A 19-year-old kid has worked out the solution. He designed a method for us to collect that tiny little bits of plastic, bring it home, and recycle it. Everybody seems to think that they're just some dumb person with no idea what to do. So as teachers, we need to figure out how can we change this thinking into one of confidence and capability. And we're going to have to work that into our teaching. I think we need to teach ideation. We need to specifically teach how to create ideas. And I've distilled that down into 7 different idea generators, places where we can get ideas from. The first one I call serendipity. Serendipity, sometimes called accidental or luck, is just coming up with an idea that seems to have just come out of thin air. This is Alexander Fleming. He was a biologist working on bacteria, and the story goes that he left bacteria in a petri dish, didn't clean it up. When he came back, he realized that mold was growing in it, and then he noticed that all around the mold, the bacteria had died. You can see it in the picture to the right here, that there is live bacteria at the bottom, there's mold at the top, and in between, there's a bunch of dead bacteria. He had accidentally, or serendipitously, discovered penicillin and thus antibiotics. There's another famous example of Percy Spencer, who was working on radar for during World War II, and while he was messing around with some magnetrons, when he turned it on, he noticed that the candy bar in his pocket melted. He then did some further tests, managed to pop some popcorn, got an egg to explode all over one of his co-workers, and ultimately invented the microwave. How did he do it? Luck, I guess. But the thing is, when you study a thing, when you understand how it works, you're more prepared, you're more ready for when this opportunity presents itself. So in essence, we can make our own luck. How do we do it? You start with writing stuff down. When we take in information, our brain doesn't know what's important and what's not. By writing it down, we basically let our brain know, this is the stuff I want to remember, and it writes it deeper into our memory. Whether you draw it, doodle, or write out sentences, it doesn't matter. The stuff that you'll remember is the stuff that you write down. So that's a good place to start. The second idea generator is something I call fantastic, and it has to do with fantasy or fiction, made-up stories, creativity. Back in the 1960s, the world was watching a show on TV called Star Trek, and there was a character on that show called Bones, or Dr. McCoy, and he had a device called a tricorder that would scan a human body and tell you exactly what was wrong with it so that he could assess the problem and then come up with the solution. Well, those tricorders, of course, are made up. The one on the left is from the early show, and then the one on the right is from a later show, suggesting that they have advanced over the years. But they're not real, or at least they weren't then. Qualcomm is a telecommunications company, and they thought, is that possible? And so they took $10 million and put it up as prize money and basically dared the scientific world to come up with a real working tricorder. They said it had to be able to capture a person's heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and you had to do it without sticking people with needles, and to be completely non-invasive. It also had to be able to diagnose several common diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis and diabetes, as many as 13 different diseases. But most importantly, had to be small and light, and anybody should be able to use it. It didn't require a doctor. They gave people 5 years, and after 5 years, in 2017, they called everybody back to see what they'd come up with, and they ended up giving out millions of dollars in prize money because multiple teams had come up with working tricorders that anyone could use that could diagnose what was wrong with you. And since then, with that prize money, these companies have gone on to improve them. Now they're working on being able to assess up to 50 different diseases, all because somebody thought about something that happened they saw in a TV show. This happens all the time. We've all seen Back to the Future. Well, in Back to the Future Part 2, the hoverboard captured everybody's imagination, and ever since, people have been trying to figure out how could we actually do this for real. The submarine, that came from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The rocket, that came from H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. What we need to do is we need to institute more reading of creative stuff and see what it is that inspires our kids. They need to read more fiction. They need to have more fun. Creative writing, that's another way to spark that creativity. Write the story of a child's birthday party, but do it from the point of view of the piñata. Who knows what's possible? We need them getting creative, because as they get creative, even if it seems like it's for no purpose, somebody else may get inspired by this sort of stuff. Make do is the third idea generator. And this idea comes from the idea that sometimes you don't have enough, and you have to be able to think outside the box to solve things with limited supplies. Recently, due to the pandemic, we ran out of the ability to make antiseptic wipes. So, why not make your own? There's so many examples of this. Famously, Apollo 13 had an explosion that almost killed all the people on board. They had to come up with a problem, but they couldn't just 3D print new materials like the International Space Station can now. They had to make do with what they had to work with. And this can be done. We can create these conditions in the classroom. We can set up engineering design challenges. We can give them limited time, limited supplies, and see what they can come up with. This sort of an idea generating mechanism can pay dividends down the road. The next idea generator is called brainstorming. And everybody's heard of brainstorming. But what's weird is, when were we ever trained in how to do it? Everybody thinks they know how to do it, and yet most people can't. For instance, if a challenge was set in front of you of come up with as many different uses for a paperclip as you possibly can, most people could come up with, you could use it as a bookmark, or a keychain, or to fix a broken zipper, maybe even to hold your hair back. But a better brainstormer would start thinking outside the box. Well, I could make things by bending it in new shapes. I could make a slingshot. I could literally make a sword, a bow and arrow. Who knows what I could make with a paperclip? And if I could think along those lines, why couldn't paperclips simply become the medium for art? Well, it has to do with the fact that most of the time brainstorming is done wrong. The most important thing about brainstorming is that you just throw ideas out and you don't judge them. As soon as people start feeling like they are being judged for their ideas, we lose the ideas, and we can't have that. We need people to think of all kinds of wild ideas, and they lead to some interesting ideas like, what if a paperclip was huge? We could build it into a building like they're thinking about doing in New York City. Kindergartners are great at this. Why couldn't you have a paperclip act as a unicorn wand? We have no idea. Kindergartners don't have any stigma about coming up with crazy ideas. Adults do. Famously, there was a thing called the marshmallow challenge, where you simply had to take some pasta, some tape, and you had a limited amount of time to take a marshmallow and hold it up off of a table as high as you possibly could. They gave this task to a bunch of adults, and the adults spent the vast majority of their time talking about who was in charge, what their plan was going to be, and then at the very end, they raced to try to put something together. It was a terrible method. They were regularly beaten by their competition, kindergartners. Kindergartners came up with crazy ideas all the time, and they simply tried to put them together. And if they didn't work, they moved on to the next crazy idea until they got something to work. And every time they beat the adults. But who's teaching this brainstorming? Sir Ken Robinson famously said, as children grow up, we start to educate them progressively from the waist up, and then we focus on their heads and slightly to one side. He suggested that schools tell us that we shouldn't be doing music because we're not going to be musicians, and we shouldn't do art because we're not going to be artists. But the consequences of this thinking is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. This is precisely the reason why brainstorming is not being used effectively, and it's mostly because we're not teaching it. We have to teach it, then practice it, and we get good at it, we get better ideas. The next idea generator is mixing experts. Imagine what could be done if we mixed Albert Einstein with Pablo Picasso. You get something completely new. This is Botticelli's famous Venus. He was considered a master. Along comes Leonardo da Vinci, who first studied human bodies scientifically, then started to paint. And you'll notice that in his Madonna on the Rocks, his painting is way more realistic, and people were blown away. Dubai is famously linking engineering with art to create buildings that actually move around a central axis. You want a view of the ocean and a view of the mountains? Wait 30 minutes, and it'll switch back and forth. If we were to give our kids more design challenges, like design a futuristic boat, but what if we did it specifically for science and then for art? A science class might come up with something like this. An art class might come up with something like this. What if we put a scientist and an artist on the same team? Inspiration. This is the next idea generator. The ancient Greeks told us that there were 9 muses that gave us all of our ideas in all of the different creative areas. Ben Franklin certainly believed it. He was famously inspired by watching somebody play water glasses, so much so that he invented the harmonica, which was a series of glass bowls with water running over it so that he could play chords using the same technique. Elon Musk says he was inspired by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein says he was inspired by Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton says he was inspired by Nikolai Copernicus. If we were simply going to teach this, we would have people study somebody famous, then get creative with it. Who knows what they could come up with? We've seen all kinds of creative crossovers. This is a great idea generator. And yet, schools focus primarily on something called brute force, made famous by this guy, Thomas Edison, who came up with 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb before he finally succeeded. And this is what we ask our kids to do. Einstein said it was insane. He said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If we trained kids on a different way to generate ideas, if they needed an idea, chances are these methods would be what we were looking for, instead of just the brute force bang your head on the wall method that seems to be the most common method that we use. If we want to create kids that can solve the big messy problems of the world, we're going to need a new plan. In fact, we're probably going to need a whole new school system. And with that, I leave you thinking about ideation. Thanks a lot.